So what is NestJS? NestJS is a framework to build scalable Node.js applications. NestJS is built with TypeScript, and you can write your applications with that JavaScript superset. NestJS can be configured to use Express or Fastify as the HTTP server framework, but providing a higher level of abstractions above those frameworks. Nest provides an out-of-the-box application architecture, making it easier to create applications with all these great characteristics, such as loose coupling, high scalability, good maintainability, and so on. If you have experience with Angular 2+ and or TypeScript, it's going to be easier for you to learn this framework, not only because it's highly encouraged to use TypeScript to implement NestJS applications, but also because there are some other concepts that are similar to the Angular concepts, such as dependency injection by using the injectable decorator or annotation, and providers and some other concepts. Some of the patterns and techniques that Nest implements are model view controller, dependency injection. We're going to see more details about dependency injection in the next slide. Data transfer object. A data transfer object is going to represent the structure of the request body. Decorators, also known as annotations. Some examples are @get or @post to implement endpoints for those HTTP verbs in a controller. Some other elements provided by Nest are pipes for data validation or data transformation. In NestJS, we also have filters, and we can do exception handling there. For example, we can create an @catch decorator or annotation to implement an exception filter to centralize the management of a specific exception, and we can return a specific JSON response to that exception. In NestJS, we also have CRUDs to implement, for example, role-based authentication, and we can also implement aspect-oriented programming by using interceptors. This is the NestJS out-of-the-box application architecture, where we can see some of the core fundamentals of the framework. When we receive a post request that includes that payload, we are going to create a controller with a decorator to handle that post HTTP verb. Then we are going to use a data transfer object or DTO to represent the structure of that JSON payload, in this case, a shop DTO. After that, we are going to use dependency injection in two cases where we are going to inject the shop service in our shop controller, and we are going to inject the data access object within the shop service. Then we have our shop class that represents the model. And if we use Mongo, for example, we're going to use the shop schema class, and we can use the model class from Mongoose. And finally, the controller is going to call the create method from the shop service, and the shop service is going to use Mongoose to insert a new job in the database. Okay, remember to like and subscribe to the channel, and let's jump into Visual Studio Code. Okay, let's get started by installing the NestJS CLI. So let's run npm install -g at nestjs/CLI. Okay, and now let's create a new application. Let's run nest new shops API. And this is going to create a bunch of files. For example, as you can see here, is going to install the tsconfig. If you want to understand what are the contents on that file or what are the settings on that file, please check out the TypeScript video. I uploaded an entire video about that topic. And it also creates a default controller here, a default test spec for that controller, a module, a service, a main file. And now we can select which package manager we are going to use. We are going to select npm. Okay, and now let's move on to the application folder. Shops API. Sorry, shops API. And here we can create a new controller. So in order to do that, we need to execute nest generate or nestg controller, and the name of the controller, that in this case we're going to create a shops API, so let's call it shops. Okay, and this created a folder within the source folder called shops with shops controller and the test spec for that controller. And it also included that controller as part of the main module of the application. So now let's go to the Visual Studio Code. And we're going to see that within the shops folder, we have our controller that is empty, and we are going to start adding the different endpoints for our API. And if we go to the app module, we're going to see that we have our controller here, this one. This import is actually the controller that we just created. So that's automatically imported when we create our controller using the NestJS CLI command. And this is a default service that is created by default when we initialize the application, the same with this module, and the same with this controller. That is going to call this a get hello method from the service. So here you can see basically the architecture that is provided out of the box by NestJS. The entry point is going to be this controller, and it's going to inject this service here. It's going to inject the service here through this constructor. And if we go to the service, we're going to see that the service, this app service, it's going to have this injectable decorator or annotation that will allow us to inject this service, in this case within this controller. And we're going to follow the same approach, the same architecture, and the same structure in our shops API. And if we want to, let me close this, and if you want to run the server in the dev environment, let's go to the package.json. This is going to generate a bunch of scripts to build the application, to format the code of the application, to start the application in production, in dev environment, here in production, in dev environment, to debug the application, etc. So we can run this script to run the application on the dev environment. So we can do npm run start : dev. Okay, now the application is running, and if we go to the main file, we're going to see that here we can set up the port where the application is going to listen. By default, the application is going to use Express as the HTTP server framework. So let's test localhost on that port. On port 3000. And if we execute the get here, okay, we're going to get the hello world. That is actually the string that is returning this default service. Okay, and now what we're going to create is the /shops resource or endpoint. So let's get started by creating that endpoint. So we're going to add a decorator or an annotation, but first we need to import that decorator from the NestJS common library. So we need to import get like that. And here we can add the decorator or annotation, add get. And here we can define our endpoint. Let's call this endpoint, this method, actually, find all. And here we can, let's say that we are going to return a string. Just to check that it works as we expect really quickly. Return find all. I forgot to add that. Okay. And now I don't know why it's throwing an error. Should be single quotes. Okay. Single quotes. And now we should be fine. Okay. Now I'm going to execute the get on localhost port 3000/shops. And I should get that string. Find all. Okay. And I'm going to add some other endpoints here. Get for reading a shop resource. Post. First, I need to, I forgot to import it. I'm going to import all of them at once. Get, post, put, and delete. These are the 4 HTTP verbs that are actually the 4 decorators that we are going to use to define our endpoints. So it's going to be post. Let's call it create. And just to test it really quickly, we're going to return the name of the method. And we're going to do the same with add put. Update. We're going to return a string. And we're going to return the name of the method. And the same with the delete endpoint. We put the delete decorator. I almost forgot to add this. Okay, let's save this and let's test the post method, for example. I'm going to create a new tab for that. Post. Let me copy this URL. And let's say that we're going to use row and we're going to send a JSON payload. So let's say that I want to create a new job. Let's pass a title. Let's say Java developer, and let's pass a salary. Salary, let's say 6,000. Okay, and if I send this request, I should receive the name of the method. Yes, create. And the same should happen with the put method. I should receive update, yes. And the same if I execute the delete method. In this case, I should pass some parameter to, and the update as well, right? For the update, for the put method, I should pass some identifier here. and the same for the delete method. But for now, we're just testing that our endpoints are responding and are up and running. So if we run this, we should receive, okay, yeah, I'm going to remove this because we are not defining a parameter. Let's do that right now. So here we should receive an ID like this. And the same for the delete endpoint. Let's save this and let's go back to Postman. And now if I enter an identifier there, I should get the name of the method. Yes, now it's able to handle it. And the same with the put method. But if I leave this parameter, this identifier in the URL, and if I call the get method, I should get an error, a 404. Yeah, correct, because we are not specifying any parameters on the get method. I should add that identifier on the get endpoint as well. So I'm going to do that. I'm going to save this. Let's go back to Postman. And if we run this, yes, I get the final, that is the name of the method here. Okay. Okay, so now let's create a service. So let's close this. And to create a service, we can run nest G, remember is a shorthand for generate service jobs. Okay, and now we have our jobs service here, this one, and by default is going to generate this service with the injectable decorator or annotation, and we can pass that object to our controller in the constructor. So constructor, first let's import that service. Import shops service from this is in the same directory, so this is going to be shops.service. And in the constructor, we can pass that dependency and inject that dependency in this controller. So this is going to be private read-only shops service, and this is going to be the shops service that we just imported. And here you can see that automatically we have this shop service to select. So this is basically one of the features that comes with TypeScript. We get auto-completion using the IDE because we have strong typing, and that's something that is one of the features of TypeScript. Okay, so let's go to the shops service. And here what we are going to do is we're going to create all the methods that we need to access our database. So in this case, we're going to keep it really simple. We are going to just inject within this shop service a model. We're going to use Mongoose to connect with a Mongo database. Before adding anything here within this shops service class, we are going to create a module within this shops folder so we can encapsulate and import the service, the controller, and we're going to need to import some other classes to interact with the database as well. So let's create a new file here. It's going to be shops.module.js. And this module is going to be pretty similar to this one. So let's grab all this, and we're going to need to make some changes. We are not going to include any of this, and we are going to include this one and this one that are within the same folder, the shops controller and the shops service. And we're going to remove this and this one. Okay, and now let's rename this as shops module. And let's go back to the shops service. And here what we need to do is we need to create an interface so we can interact with the database. So the shop service is going to be pretty simple. We are going to pass a model class from Mongoose and a shop interface to access the database. And we're going to pass that model in the constructor here. So first, let's create our shops interface. So let's create a new folder. Let's call it interfaces. And here we are going to create a new file that's going to be shops.interface.ts. And here we're going to export interface. This is going to be the shop interface. And here we are going to include an identifier that is going to be optional because we are not going to pass an identifier when we create a new job in the database, for example. So that's why it's optional. So it's going to be a string. Then we're going to have a title for the job. There is going to be a string as well. And then we're going to have the salary. That is going to be a number. Okay. And here is this. And I'm going to rename this. And I'm going to remove, yes, it's going to be just shop. Another thing that we need to interact with MongoDB besides this shop interface is an schema. So let's create the shop schema for MongoDB. So I'm going to create a new folder. Actually, I need to move this here within the jobs. Yes, let's move, yeah. And here I need to create a new folder. It's going to be schemas. And here we're going to create a new file. That is going to be shop.schema.ts. And here we need to import Mongoose. Let's say import as Mongoose from Mongoose. And now let's create the schema. So export const shop schema equals new mongoose dot schema. And here we're going to define the fields of the document. And we're going to have a title. That's going to be a string. And salary. That is going to be a number. Okay, probably I need to install Mongoose, right? npm install Mongoose. Okay, now we have Mongoose, so now we don't have any errors here. And now let's go back to the shop module. And here what we need to import is the Mongoose module. Let's add it here, import Mongoose module from at NestJS /Mongoose. We probably need to install that. Yeah. So let's install this. npm install. Okay, now we have that dependency installed. We need to also import the schema of the job. So import shop schema from, and this is within the schema folder. Sorry, like this, schemas / job schema. Okay, and here we need to add Mongoose module that for feature, and here we need to pass the shop schema like this. This is an array, and we need to pass the object here. That's going to have two properties: the name, that's going to be a job, and the schema associated to it, that is going to be shop schema, like that. Okay, let me rename this, and let me remove this. Okay, let's add some space here, and I think we're good to go. Okay. Okay, something's wrong here. Export. Yeah, that's the issue. Okay, and now we should be fine. Great. Okay, so now we can go back to our service and we can inject the model. So we can add the constructor and we pass the model here. But first we need to import a couple of things. We need to import our interface, that is the shops interface, from this is within the interfaces folder. Shop interface, and then we need to import the model class from Mongoose. And finally, we need to import the inject model option from the Mongoose module within NestJS. Import inject model from at NestJS. Okay. And here we can pass inject model, and we pass shop. As the name of the model, private, read-only, shop model, and here we use the model class from Mongoose, that one. And here we need to pass the interface that we created. That is going to be shop. Okay. Now we have our Mongoose model ready to use. There's an error here. No, it's shop, like that. Okay. Okay, and now some other things that we need to import in order to connect with MongoDB. We need to go to the main module of the application, and we need to import a couple of things here. We need to import the module that we created. It's going to be shops module from, and this is within the shops folder. This one actually. Like that. Let me check. Shop module. Okay, I'm going to rename this. Actually, it should be shops module. Okay, shops module. Okay, let's go back, and this is yes, great. And let's rename this as shops module. Okay, that's one thing. We also need to import the Mongoose module. Import Mongoose module from, and this is going to be this one. Okay, now we have the shops module, the Mongoose module, and we need to add those imports here. So here we have the shops module, and here we need to pass Mongoose module, and here we pass the URL for root. Okay, and here we need to paste the MongoDB URI. It's going to be a string, and it's going to be 27.0.17, and the database is going to be shops. Let's save this, and we have everything ready to interact with our database from this service. Okay, so let's create some methods. So we're going to need 4 methods to be called from the controller. So let's go back to the controller. So we're going to need one method in the service to get a shop by ID, another method to create a new shop, another one to update a job, and the last one to delete an existing shop. So let's go back to the service and let's start working on those methods. Let's create the first method that is going to be find, where we're going to pass an identifier of the job that is going to be a string. And here, all the methods that we are going to use from this Mongoose model are going to return a promise. So here we need to set the type as promise, and in this case, it's going to return a job. So we need to add that interface as part of the signature of the method. And here, what we are going to do is return. Actually, this is going to need to be an async method. And here we're going to use await. So this is going to be this, that, shop model, that, find one. And here we're going to pass the identifier that in this case of that for Mongo is going to be _ID, and we pass the ID that we receive as an argument. That's going to be the first one. Then we need to create another one to create a new job. So it's going to be also an async method, create, and it's going to receive a job. And this is going to return a promise as well, like this. So we need to define a new job here, const new job. And here we need to do new this that show model, and we need to pass the job. And here we're going to return await new job that save. Okay, the next one is going to be the update method, and we need to use pretty much the same. The only thing that is going to change is that we're going to receive two parameters. One is going to be the identifier. It's going to be the string, and the other one is going to be the job. And here we're going to return await this that shop model that, and here we're going to use the find by ID and update method. Find by ID and update. And we're going to pass the identifier, the job, and we're gonna set that if the item, and we're gonna set that if the job doesn't exist, it's going to create a new one. New true. And yeah, we need to rename this method as update. Okay, that's the update method. And then we're going to create the last one that is going to be the delete method. And here we only need to pass the identifier. So it's going to be ID string, and it's going to return the same promise as before. And this is going to return await this that shop model, and we're going to use the find by ID and remove method. Find by ID and remove, and we just pass the identifier here. Okay, and now we have our service ready with all the methods that we need, and we need to start working on our controller so we can call these methods and start finding existing jobs, creating jobs, updating jobs, and removing jobs. So let's go back to the controller and let's start using this job service. But first, we need to create a DTO to model the structure of the payload that we are going to receive. So this is the JSON object that we're going to receive. It's going to have two properties, title and salary, the same that we defined it here on the interfaces, here, title and salary. Okay, let's go back to the controller and let's create a DTO. So let's create a folder within the shops folder. That is going to be DTOs. And let's create a new file. That's going to be shop.dto.ts. And here we're going to export the class. We're going to call it shop.dto. And we're going to have two properties here. Read-only title, that's going to be a string. And read-only salary, that's going to be a number. And that's pretty much it. Okay, and now if we go back to the shops controller, we need to import that DTO. So import shop DTO from DTOs slash shop.dto. Okay, the first one, we don't need the DTO here, so we just call this that shop service that find, and we pass the identifier that we need to, actually it's not find all, it's find, and we need to pass the identifier here. Actually, this needs to be a param. This is another decorator that we need to import first. So let's do that. Param. And now we can use it on our method. So find at param. And the name is going to be ID. And here we pass that ID as a parameter to our service. And here is going to give us an error because this method within the shop service is returning a promise. So we need to add that to the signature of this method. So now we are good. Yeah, I need to import also this shop interface. So let's do that. So here it's going to be shop from interfaces, shop interface. Okay, now we're good. Okay, the next one, here we're going to need the DTO. And we're going to need to import another decorator. That's going to be the body decorator, this one. So now we can use it in our post endpoint. Like this, add body. And here we create the shop parameter that's going to have the type shop DTO. And here we're going to use again the service, this that service, shop service, sorry, that create, and we're going to pass the DTO. Okay, and now this is going to return the promise. And if we go to the job, so we have the interface, and if we go back to the DTO, we're going to see that we have title and salary that are part of the interface definition here. Title and salary, and the identifier, we defined that property as optional, so everything works just fine. Okay, let's go back. Let me close this. Let's go back to the controller. Sorry, not this one. The shops controller, this one actually. And let's move on and let's work on the update method. Here we are passing this ID that is going to be part of the URL, but also we need to pass the payload here. So we're going to use the body decorator again. We're going to pass the DTO. And we're going to also here use the param decorator. And here we receive the identifier as part of the URL. So the param is basically taking the data from the query string, and the body decorator is going to get the data from the body of the request. And here I need to find the identifier. Okay, and here I need to call the service method. So again, I need to return the promise. So let's do that. And I need to call the service here. This dot shop service dot update, and I'm going to pass two arguments: the identifier and the DTO. Okay, that again. Here we have the identifier, and here we have the interface, and the DTO is compliant with that interface, so we are good. Okay, and the last one is going to return this promise as well. I mean the delete method. And we only need to pass the identifier in this case. Let's save this. And here we need to call again the shop service and the delete method. And we only pass the identifier. Okay, let's start the server again. Okay, there is an error here. Okay, I found the error here. What we need to do is we need to remove these modules, we need to remove this, the controller and the server from the app module, because we already imported that controller and that service here within the shops module file. So we are going to remove that from here, and I'm going to keep it just in the shops module. I'm going to remove this and this. Okay, and now we should be fine. Yeah, we have the routes. So now we can test our controller. So let's start by creating a new job. So I'm going to use the post method to remove this, and I'm going to run this. Okay, we have our new shop created. So if we go to the database, we should see here, refresh, we should see one document here. That is actually this one. Okay, so now let's take the identifier and let's try to get that shop. So slash identifier, and if we submit this, yes, we get the same information. And then we get the information. Okay, and now let's execute a put method. So let's change for C++ developer. Let's send this. And now we get the shop modified and the title has changed. And if we go to the database and we refresh this, sorry, close this. And if I refresh, and if I open the existing document, yeah, we have the new title assigned to this document. Okay, let's close this. Let's go back to Postman and let's execute a remove. So let's run the delete HTTP verb. So if I send this, yeah, I get the removed element. And if we go to the database and I refresh, we shouldn't have any documents. Yeah. So we don't have any documents here. The NestJS exception filters can be applied using a decorator in a method or in a controller, or we can globally apply a filter by declaring it in our main TS file. Let's jump into VS Code and let's see how we can use exception filters. On a previous video, we created our shops controller. Basically, here we defined all the different endpoints of our API. We defined a get endpoint, a post, a put, and a delete endpoint. Let's execute the post endpoint, for example. So let's create a new job. And let's pass C++ developer as the title, as the salary, we pass 7,000. So let's run this. And okay, so now we created in our MongoDB a new developer. So if we go to the MongoDB database, we're gonna see that we can access that document. Here in the jobs database, we have that document, C++ developer, and the salary as 7,000. Okay, so let's go back. Let's grab this identifier, and with this identifier, we can go to the API, and we can get the shop information. Okay, but what happens if we change the identifier? Let's put something random here, and we send a request. So we still get a 200 response, and that's not correct for a RESTful API because we want to receive, in this case, when we don't get any results, we're going to get a 404 or an HTTP and not found. So let's make a change in our get endpoint. Let's go back to our controller. And let's make a change here in our get endpoint so we can return an HTTP status according to the result. So if we don't get any results from the database, we need to return an not found HTTP response, a 404. So here, what we need to do is we need to handle this promise. So we are going to add a then here. And I'm going to create an arrow function to handle this promise response, where I'm going to receive a result. And what I want to do here is, if I get a result, I'm going to return that result. But if we don't get any results, I want to throw an exception. So this will allow us to see how NestJS handles HTTP exceptions by default. And then we are going to create our exception filter, and we're going to see the difference between the two strategies, the NestJS default strategy and the filter strategy with the class that we are going to create. So now what we're going to do here is I'm going to throw an exception, throw new HTTP exception, and I'm going to pass the message shop.found, and I'm going to pass the HTTP status, and I'm going to return the HTTP status as not found. Actually, the HTTP code is 404. So I'm going to return that. And I'm going to also add a catch block here. I'm going to create another arrow function for this. And here I'm going to throw the same exception. Okay, let's try this now. And now we send the request, and we receive a 404 as we expected, and the message that we just entered there. Okay, so this is the default behavior of NestJS. And now I am going to create a filter, and I'm going to centralize the exception management using that filter. And first, I'm going to grab this code from the NestJS documentation, and I'm going to customize this filter a little bit. I'm going to create a new folder. This is going to be filters, and I'm going to create a new file. That's going to be http exception.filter.ts. And here I'm going to paste the code that I grabbed from the NestJS documentation website. Okay, basically what it's doing here is implementing the exception filter interface with this HTTP exception filter, is using this catch decorator with this HTTP exception as a parameter. So it's going to catch all the HTTP exceptions depending on the scope that we define. We're going to see that in a second. And here what it's doing is extracting the response, the request, is extracting the status code from the exception, and it's generating this response, including the status code, and a JSON with the status code, a timestamp, a path, and we can add whatever we want. For example, the description, HTTP error, or something like that. Okay, and now what we can do with this filter, this HTTP exception filter that we are going to import into the controller now. Import. Let's copy this. HTTP exception filter from filters, HTTP exception filter. And here we can apply this filter at a method level or at a controller level. And in order to do that, we can use a specific decorator that is called use filters, where we can pass a list of filters. In this case, we are going to pass just this one, HTTP exception filter. We can pass it in two ways. If we just pass the class name as it is now, the framework is going to inject using the dependency injection mechanism. It's going to inject the instance of this filter, the instance of this class. Or we can create the instance ourselves like this, and it's going to work either way. So let's just put the class name. So NestJS is going to inject an instance for us. Okay, let's try this now. Let's go back to Postman and let's execute this request on a random with a random identifier that we know that is not in the database. So if I execute this request, now I get the custom JSON that I defined on the filter, as we can see here. That we have a status code, a timestamp, a path, and a description. This description, HTTP error. So that's one way of specifying or applying the filter, right, at the method level. We can also apply the same filter. I'm going to grab this and move it at the controller scope. So if we throw an exception in any of these endpoints, it's going to apply this filter at the controller level. So let's try this now. And if we go back, and if we run this, we should get the same response. Yes, we get the same response as before. And if I remove this completely, we can include that exception filter globally in our main file. So I'm going to grab this and I'm going to paste it here. I'm going to import this filter here in our main.js file. I'm going to change the path. And what I can do here is I can do app that use global filters, and here I can pass a list of filters. In this case, I'm going to pass this, only this filter. And here is, here I need to create an instance of it. Okay, and let's go now, and let's execute a request again, and we're gonna get the same result. So we applied this filter at a method level, then we applied the same filter using the decorator at a controller level, and finally we created, or we applied this filter globally. NestJS Validation Pipes. We can apply validation pipes using a decorator in a parameter, in a method, or in a controller. Or we can globally apply a validation pipe, declaring it in our main.js file. Let's jump into VS Code and let's see an example of a validation pipe. Okay, now let's create a validation pipe. So as you may remember, NestJS allows us to use DTOs to encapsulate the body that we receive as part of the requests in our endpoints, for example, in our post endpoint. So what we're going to do first, I'm going to stop the server, and I'm going to install a couple of dependencies. So I'm going to run npm install save class validator and class transformer. Okay, and the first thing that I need to do here, let's run the server again. I'm going to the DTO, and what I'm going to do here is I'm going to import the class validator library, import from class validator, and I'm going to import a couple of decorators. Is string and is int. And I'm going to use these decorators here. String and is int. Okay, and using these decorators, I'm going to be able to validate the input. But another thing that I need to add is the actual pipe. So I'm going to create a new folder. Let's call it pipes. And I'm going to grab the validation pipe from the NestJS website. We also have the alternative to use Choi. Choi is another library. In this case, we're going to use class validator. Okay, and this is the validation pipe that I want to use. So let's create a new file here. Let's call it validation.pipe.ts, and let's paste code. And this is going to implement the pipe transform interface, and it's going to make some validations, it's going to make some transformations. And here I'm going to change this to any, so we don't get any errors. Okay. So let's go back to our controller. And here what we can do is we can apply, this is pretty similar to the filters, where we can apply the validation pipe at a method level, a controller level, a global level, and also at a parameter level. So we can actually add the validator here. So that's going to be the first thing that we're going to test. We can add the validate. Let's grab this one. We can use the validation pipe like this, and we need to import it first, actually. So import validation pipe from pipes validation.pipe. And here we are going to validate this shop DTO at the param level. So let's go back to Postman and let's execute a post request, but instead of passing a number, an integer, we're going to pass a string here. So we should get an error. Yeah, we get the HTTP error. Remember that we still have running here in our main.ts file. We still have this exception filter. So we can do something different here. If we go back to the pipe, we're going to see that what we are throwing here is a bad request exception. So we can copy this exception. This is not a good practice, but just for the sake of giving an example of this, I'm going to copy and paste. Of course, we need to create a superclass, we need to extend it, we need to try to don't repeat ourselves, but just for the sake of the example, I'm going to copy and paste this. I'm going to rename this, and I'm going to call it validation exception filter.ts. And here I'm going to catch this bad request exception. And let's make a couple of changes here. Yes, I need to import this. Okay. Here we can say bad request. Let's say this. And now if we go back to the main.ts file, we can use that filter. So let's import it. This is bad. Let's grab it from here. Actually, I'm going to rename this one. to validation filter or validation exception filter. That's going to be better. And I'm going to import that here. Validation exception filter, and I need to change this. This is going to be validation exception data filter, and I'm going to use this one. Okay, now if we go back to Postman and we execute the same request, we should get a different description. I'm going to run this, and we get the description that we specified for that exception specific. So in this case, we are using two things. We are using this validation pipe, and we are using also a validation exception filter. And if we go back to the controller, we can also define this validator, or we can apply this validator at the method level. We can say, this is use pipes, and we can pass, this is the validation pipe actually. Yeah. So if we execute the request again, we should get the same response. Yes. We get the bad request, and we get the description that we specified on the filter for the validation exceptions. And we can also use pipes at the controller level. So let's do that. And let's go back to Postman and let's run this again. And we're going to get the same response. And if we remove this from here, I'm going to save this. I'm going to grab the validation pipe, and I'm going to include this validation pipe globally in our main.ts file. I'm going to change the path, and I'm gonna use here app.use global pipes, and I'm going to include the name of the pipe. I need to create a new instance of the validation pipe actually. Validation pipe. And now if we go back to Postman and if we run the same request, we should get the same response. NestJS Custom Decorators. We can create a custom decorator to be more specific regarding the request that we receive in our endpoints. And custom decorators will allow us to improve the code readability of our application. It's going to improve the reusability. And we can also apply pipes on these custom decorators, for example, a validation pipe. Or we can also access a particular property from our custom decorator. A custom decorator can also be useful if we need to pass the data of an authenticated user in multiple endpoints. So let's go to VS Code and let's create a custom decorator for our API. Okay, and now let's create a custom decorator. So I'm going to create a new folder. Decorators. And I'm going to create a new file. I'm going to call this showdata.decorator.ts. And here, what I'm going to do is I'm going to import a function. The function is create param decorator from the NestJS common library. NestJS. Okay. And here, what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a constant, shop data, and I'm going to use that function to create my custom decorator. The idea is to use this decorator instead of using body here. Let's go back to the controller. So instead of using @body as the decorator, I want to use @shopData. So it's not just a generic body, it's a specific request that I'm going to describe there, right? I'm going to describe this shop DTO data. So let's go back to the decorator, and here is going to, this function is going to receive an arrow function. Where I'm going to receive that data, I'm going to receive a data argument. It's going to be a string, and then the request. And here what I'm going to do is I'm going to return if I get data, I'm going to return the body of the request. I'm going to add a condition here to check that I received the data. Break that body data. And in the other case, I'm going to return the body completely. Okay, let's go back to the controller. And I'm going to import that custom decorator. So import shop data from decorators shop data.decorator. And now I can use that decorator here, for example. Shop data. And now I should be able to create a new job as usual. So let's say Java developer 8000. Let's run this. And I am able to create it. And we still have our validation pipe and our validation exception filter running. So if I pass this as a string, I should get an error. Yes, I get the same error as before. So still running. I'm going to comment this. And I'm going to apply this validation pipe at this level, at the param level, so I can pass it here. And if I run this request again, I should get the same error. Yeah, I get the error, but I'm not wrapping, I'm not using the custom exception, so I'm going to add that exception here. So I'm going to use the filter, use filters, and I'm going to pass the, let me go back to the main.js, this one, validation exception filter. I'm going to pass that one. Okay, I think I have to import it. Okay, let's grab this from here. Let's go back to the controller. And let's paste it here. Let's paste it here. And change the path. Yes, like that. Okay, and now we should get the error, and we should get the JSON that we specified here with this button request in the description. So let's go back to Postman and let's run this again. And yes, we get the JSON that we specified on that validation exception filter. So if we go back to, let me close everything here. So if we go back to the controller, to the shops controller here, we are using a custom decorator with a validation pipe. And we are also using the validation filter or the exception filter here at the method level. NestJS Middlewares. A middleware is a function that is called before the route handler with access to the request and response objects and the next middleware function. If the current middleware function is not able to end the request response cycle, it must call the next function to pass control to the next middleware function. By default, a NestJS middleware is equivalent to an Express middleware. What can I do in a middleware function? I can execute any code. I can make changes to the request and the response objects. I can end the request response cycle, or I can call the next middleware function. Okay, let's jump into Visual Studio Code and let's create a custom middleware to audit some specific operations performed in our API. Okay, as you may remember, in the first video of the NestJS crash course, we created an API, a shops API actually, and we implemented a controller, that is this one. And here we created some methods for each of the endpoints of our RESTful API. We created a get operation where we are passing the identifier of the shop to get that specific job. We created a post method to create a new job. We also created a put method to update the data of a specific job. And we also added a delete operation. And here we have this decorator. These are actually decorators. And here we have the decorator to handle the delete HTTP method. So what we're going to do now is we're going to create a custom middleware to actually audit all the delete operations that are going to be performed in our API. So a middleware will be executed before reaching this method here. So what we're going to do is we're going to log some specific data from the request. And so let's do that now. I'm going to create a folder, middlewares, and I'm going to create a new file here. And I'm going to call it audit.middleware.ts. And here, what I need to do is I need to create a class, export class audit middleware. And this class needs to implement the Nest middleware interface. So Nest middleware. And here, the Nest middleware interface, if we go inside that interface, we need to implement this method. So we are going to run a quick fix here. This is going to automatically add a template for that method. And here we have the template of the method. And as we can see here, we get access to the request, the response, and the next function of the request response lifecycle. So here we can use the Express classes. So request, this is actually an interface from Express. If we go here, if we go there, we're going to see that this is an interface. Okay. And also here we can import the response. from Express, like that. And here we can say that this is going to be a function, actually, function. Okay. And here we are going to start working on our audit logic, right? This needs to be injectable. So we are going to use that decorator here. And now what we're going to do here is we're going to console log some properties from the request. We're going to log the IP address, the path, and the headers, for example. We can do that. Login, delete, request, IP. And we can access the IP property from the request. Console that log. And I'm going to copy this. Login, delete, request, and path. And we can access the path property from the request. Request that path, like that. And we can also access the headers, for example. So login, delete, request, headers. And we can access the headers property from the request, like that. And this is our audit middleware. So every time that we receive a delete request, we are going to log all these properties from the request: the IP address, the path, and the headers. And now we need to set it up. So in order to set it up, we are going to do that within the shops module that includes the controller, the service. And what we need to do here is we need to implement an interface that is the Nest module interface. And if we go here, this is going to give us a quick fix here. And this is going to add the skeleton of the configure method. If we go to the interface, we're going to see that that's the only method that we need to implement. So let's go back. And let's click here on quick fix and implement interface Nest module. Okay. And I'm going to remove this. And I'm going to remove this here. And I'm going to add this here, because I can import that middleware consumer from the NestJS common library. Okay, and here what we're going to do is we're going to apply the middleware that we just created to the consumer, to this middleware consumer. So first I'm going to import audit middleware from that middleware / audit middleware. And we're going to pass that class here in the apply function. And because we created this audit middleware class as injectable, using this injectable decorator, the NestJS framework, let me close this, the NestJS framework is going to automatically create an instance for us here. And after this, we can set up the routes that we want to use to apply this audit middleware. So we can say for routes, and we can pass an object. And this object is going to include a couple of attributes. One is going to be the path. In this case, we're going to use the shops path. If we go to the controller, we have the shops string as part of the URL, and we're going to use that to set up our middleware here. So we're going to say shops slash, and we're going to use the wildcard. And here we're going to set the method. That is going to be the delete HTTP method, like that. And that's all we need to set up our audit middleware for this specific method. And now if we go back to Postman and click on send, okay, we have some shop postings already there. And I'm going to remove one of these. And we're going to see here in the log, we're going to see these messages, the IP address, the path, and the headers. Okay, so let's run this delete operation. And as we can see, we get the IP address. This is localhost using IPv6. This is the path. And these are the headers of the requests, of the request. And the problem here is that what we need to do here is we need to call the next function. So I'm going to add that here, just below this console log. And now is going to actually run the delete operation. And let's run it again. Let's delete that shop posting. And now it's actually executed. And here we have all the messages that we defined here in our audit middleware. Login, delete, request IP, path, and headers. And if we go back to Postman and we execute the get operation, we are not going to see this element again. It was actually removed. NestJS Interceptors. Interceptors allow us to implement aspect-oriented programming, so we can add extra logic before or after the execution of a method. We can transform the result of a function. We can transform the exception thrown from a function. We can extend the basic function behavior, or we can completely override a function depending on specific conditions, for example, caching. As we've already seen with pipes, interceptors can be controller scoped, method scoped, or global scoped. And an interceptor implements the intercept method with access to the execution context that is actually an instance of the execution context class. Using that class instance, we can access the HTTP request and response objects. Let's jump into Visual Studio Code and let's see how we can use interceptors for caching and also for benchmarking in our API. Okay, we are going to set up first a caching interceptor, and we are going to install a library for that. npm install save, and it's going to be a cache manager. And this cache is going to be in memory. We can also set up this cache using Redis, for example. We can use some decorators that are part of the NestJS common library. And for example, we can set the key of our cache using this decorator. We can say here, single quotes, all jobs. And we can set up the TTL of this specific, for this specific method. Now we're going to see how we can set it up globally. And this is going to override the TTL that we defined there. But first, let's define it locally. And here we can say 15 seconds, for example. And we can do the same for this method here. And here we can say, I don't know, 30. And we need to use this interceptor. There's another decorator called use interceptors. And here we can add a list of interceptors. In this case, we're going to use the cache interceptor. That is actually this one. Okay. And to set it up, we need to go to our shops module. We need to add the cache module, like this. Cache module that register. And here we pass an object as a parameter. And here we set the TTL, the global TTL in this case. Let's say 5 seconds. These are seconds. And the maximum quantity of items within that cache. Let's say, I don't know, 100. Maximum number of items in cache. And that's all we need to set up our in-memory cache. If you want to set up Redis, for example, we need to add some more parameters here, such as the URL, the port, etc. Okay, let's try this. I'm going to start the server again. And let's go to Postman. And here, first, I'm going to execute the GET request. This should be caching this data for 15 seconds. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to remove one element directly from the database. And I'm going to remove the first element. So I'm going to delete this document. But I should still get it. Yeah, I still get it. But if we wait a couple of seconds, now, yeah, was removed. So let's go back. And the same is going to happen for this find endpoint, for this get endpoint by ID. So we can run this. Let's create. Now let's add this identifier here. Okay, we still get that element. But let's go to the cache. Sorry, let's go to the database. And let's remove that one. It's actually this one, the first one. Let's remove that document. And now we call it. We still get it. It's going to be available for 30 seconds. Okay, and now it's no longer available. Great. Okay, now we have our cache all set. And now what we are going to do is we're going to create a benchmark interceptor that is going to log the execution time of each of these methods here. Okay, so let's do that. I'm going to create a new folder. I'm going to call it, let me close this. Okay, I'm going to create a new folder. Let's call it Interceptors. And I'm going to add a new file. This is going to be benchmark.interceptor.ts. Okay, now I'm going to grab this class from the NestJS documentation, and I'm going to tweak it a little bit. I'm going to add a couple of things. We have access to the execution context. That is actually this interface that extends argument host. And we're going to use this method to access this interface where we can get the request and the response. And we are going to extract the HTTP request URL and method, and we're going to show the execution time for that specific endpoint using that HTTP method. Okay, let's go back. Let's close this and this. Okay, and here what I'm going to do is I'm going to get the context const ctx equals context that switch to HTTP, and now I'm able to access the HTTP request object. So const request equals ctx dot get request. This is going to be the express request. So I'm going to import that one, the first one. And I'm going to log, use the console. I'm going to log the endpoint. Request that URL. And I'm going to log the HTTP method that I'm using to execute that endpoint. Method request that method. Yeah, and here what we are doing is we are running the next middleware in the request response lifecycle. That is actually the one that we receive here. And after that execution, we execute this tap operation, and we are logging the execution time. So here we get the timestamp before running the method, and at the end, what we do here is the difference between the current date. This is where the method finishes to run, and the timestamp that we assigned before running the method. Okay, here we can say execution time. Let's go back to the controller, and the only thing that we need to do here is we need to import this benchmark interceptor. Let's rename it as benchmark interceptor. And let's import it first. Import from interceptors benchmark.interceptor. And now we can add it to this list for this use interceptors decorator. And that's all we need. This is going to show the benchmark or the execution time for every endpoint here on this controller. Okay, let's go back to Postman and let's run this endpoint. Let's do this. Let's run a find all endpoint. And if we see here, we get the endpoint, the method, and the execution time for that operation. And let's remove an element. And in this case, we're going to see the benchmarking, and we're also going to see these messages here that are part of the middleware. So let's run this. And if we go back here, first the middleware is going to log all these messages, the IP address, the path, and the headers, and then we're going to see the benchmark interceptor running. That's going to show the endpoint, the method, and the execution time. Okay, so far we've been working on a RESTful API. We created a controller here to handle different HTTP methods of our shops API. We implemented the get, post, put, etc. And now what we're going to do is we're going to reuse this controller, but in a different way. So in order to create our web application, doing the rendering on the server, we need to create a couple of folders first. We are going to create a public folder where we're going to store the CSS files, the fav icons, some images, logos, the robot file, etc. And we are also going to create a new folder. We are going to call it views, where we are going to include the HTML templates, and we're going to use two template engines. The first one is going to be Pug, index.pug. So here, Pug. Here we are going to include the HTML using this template engine, and we're going to create another one that's going to be index.hbs, where we're going to use handlebars. Handlebars is a superset of mustache, and Pug was previously known as Shade, the Shade framework. And here we are going to create, I'm going to create a new folder actually. It's just to keep things organized. I'm going to move these files there. So we are going to use our shops controller. That is this one. And I'm going to keep those views within the shops folder just to be consistent with the naming and the structure. Okay. The next thing that we need to do is we need to update, let me close this. And we need to update our main.ts file so we can set these folders, the public and the views folder in the application. So we're going to use Express, and we need to make some changes here. Here we need to use the Nest Express application. And we're going to pass the app module. And we need to import that class. Import, I'm going to copy the class name. And we need to import this from NestJS Platform Express. And now we have to associate these different folders, our static assets folder and our views folder. So app.use static assets, and we need to pass the public directory, and we are going to use join. We're going to use the dir name. This is our reserved word, and we're going to position this on one level above the current file, and we're going to pass the folder name that is public. And we need to import the join function. Okay, and now I need to associate the views directory using set base views dir. And this is going to be pretty much the same. Instead of public, it's going to be views. And we should also associate the view engine. App.set view engine. And we're going to start using Pug. Okay, the next step is going to be installing actually the view engine. I'm going to install two. I'm going to install Pug and Handlebars. So we can use Pug, or we can use HBS, that is Handlebars. So I'm going to run npm install save Pug and Handlebars. Okay, the next thing that we need to do is we need to go to the main module of the application, and I'm going to remove this default controller, this service. We are not going to use those. I'm going to remove these dependencies here. And now I'm going to make some changes in the shops controller. I'm going to use this method where we get the list of jobs. And I'm going to rename this function as root. I'm going to remove the type. And I'm going to add a decorator to associate the view. The decorator is render. And I'm going to pass the view here. That is going to be index. Sorry. That is going to be shops/index. So it's going to be actually these views that we created here within the views folder. Okay, let's go back. And here what I'm going to do, I'm going to change this a little bit because this is returning a promise. And this is actually an array of shops like that. And let's go back. So I'm going to make some changes here. And I'm going to add a then statement. Where I'm going to receive a result. And if I get results, I need to return a specific structure, a specific model that is required to be rendered in the view. I need to return an object, and this object needs to include some attribute so I can access it from the view. So if we get any results, I'm going to return this object. I'm going to add an attribute, create an object with just one attribute that is going to be shops. And it's going to include this array of shops. But if we don't get any results, I'm just going to return an empty array. It's going to be like this. Shops and an empty array. Shops. Like that. Okay, and now we can work on our views that are going to render this model. This one. Okay, let's open. First, let's work with the index using Pug. So HTML, head, we're going to assign a title. We're going to call it Pug shop index. And we need to add a body. And we're going to add a list. And each item of this list is going to be a job that we are going to get from this method. Okay, and here I'm going to iterate through the collection that we get. That is actually this collection, this shops collection. And here is going to be each shop in shops. Shops is the attribute name of that model. And here we are going to create a list item where we are going to include the shop title and the salary. like that. Okay, let's try this. Again, run start.dev. And now let's open the browser in localhost 3000 /shops/ and yeah, we should be able to get. Okay, something is wrong. Let's see what's going on. Oh, okay, my bad. This is shops/index. Okay, let's save this. Let's try again. And here we get undefined. Okay, some typo there. Let me check. Yeah, it's not title, it's title. Okay, let's refresh. Okay, here we get all the elements. I didn't show you the database, but if you go to the database, let me open the database. Here's the shops collection, and we have these 4 documents: C++ developer, C developer, C# developer, and JavaScript developer. All these 4. Okay, let's close all this. Let's go back. And now let's create. First, let's change the view engine to handlebars. And let's create our HTML template here. So this needs to be HTML, type HTML, HTML. Let's add header, head, title. Let's call it HBS. And check the name just to shop index. Let's add the body. And here we are with another list. And we're going to iterate each element of the shops collection. Shops. I need to close this each statement. And within this, I'm going to add a list item. And here I can access the attribute of each shop, like this: title, and the salary. Okay, we have the handlebars view engine assigned. So if we refresh, we should get a different title, HBS shop index, but the same list. Let's try this now. And yes, we get the same list, and we get HBS for handlebars and shop index. Okay, so we've been working so far on our shop posting API, and we created a controller where we defined different endpoints: get endpoints, post, put, delete. And we also created a DTO for the post and the put operations, this one. And those are the 2 classes that we are going to be changing, or we are going to add documentation using some Swagger decorators. Once we add those decorators, we are going to be able to generate an interactive documentation that we will be able to access from the web browser. And we're going to see the different endpoints, the schema, the data structure, some other things that we're going to define on these decorators. And we are going to be able also to test the API, get the shop postings available, create new shop postings, update postings, delete postings. Before adding any Swagger decorators, we need to install some dependencies. So let's do that now. npm install NestJS Swagger. And we also need to install Swagger UI Express. Remember that with NestJS, we can use Express, that is the default HTTP framework, or we can also use Fastify. And if we are using Fastify, we need to install a different set of dependencies for Swagger. But in this case, we are using Express. So we need to install specifically this one, Swagger UI Express. Okay, let's run this. Okay, the first thing that we need to do to set up Swagger, we need to go to our main.ts file, and we need to create a couple of elements here. We need to create the Swagger configuration, where we're going to set a title, a description, the version of our API. So let's do that. This is going to be Swagger config. And here I'm going to create a new document builder. And here I'm going to set the title. Let's import this first. Okay, I'm going to import. Document builder from NestJS/Swagger. And now I'm going to set the title. This will be shop postings API. We're going to set the description. It's going to be shop postings CRUD API. We're going to set the version of the API. It's going to be 1.0. And to finish, we need to include that. We need to call the build method of the document builder object. And now we need to create a document using the Swagger module class. Const doc equals Swagger module that create document, and we need to pass the app. That is actually the application that we create with the Nest factory. And we need to pass the Swagger configuration that we just created using the document builder here. And we need to also call the setup method of the Swagger module library. And here we're going to define the URL that is going to be API. And we pass the app that is the NestJS application. And we need to pass the doc. That is the document that we created here. Okay, now let's go to the controller. And here we can add some decorators. We can add an API tags decorator, API tags. As we can see here, this decorator was automatically imported here on line 5. And here we are going to set shops as the tags for this API. Okay, and some other decorators that we can add here are, for example, we can add API, yeah, OK response is one of those. This is actually a decorator from NestJS. This extends some decorators from Swagger. And here we can pass the description. In this case, it's going to be the resource list has been successfully returned. In this case, this is the find all method where we are returning all the shop postings available. So this is one of the decorators for our endpoints. And we can also add another decorator. And let's say that we want to return at some point an HTTP 403, a forbidden response. API forbidden response. We can also set a decorator for that response. And here we can add the description to document this response. So we have the description. And here we're going to say forbidden, just to keep it simple. And here we can add these decorators to the rest of the endpoints. And for the post method, we can use, here we can change, the description. The resource has been successfully returned because here we are accessing just one element using the identifier. And we got the type of identifier that is going to be a string. And I think I need to add that here as well. Yes, I'm going to add that here, string, and here. And for the post operation, there is another decorator that is the API created response. That here we're going to change the description, and this is going to be the resource has been successfully created. And for the rest, we are going to use these two. The first one is going to be the resource has been successfully updated. And the last one is going to be the resource has been successfully removed. We are going to also make some changes in our DTO. And here we're going to use the API property decorator, this one. And here we can pass some parameters. We can pass a type. That in this case is going to be a string. We can pass a description. We can put something like the title of the shop position. And we can set a default value. We're going to leave that empty. Okay, and the same for the other attribute. In this case, the type is going to be a number. Here we're going to say the expected salary of the shop position. And the default is going to be 3K. And let's try this. So I'm going to run npm run start dev. Okay, and now I'm going to open the browser on localhost 3000/API. and we're going to see the documentation. This is, let's go back a little bit. This is the title that we assigned here, Shop Postings API. This is the description that we assign here, Shop Postings CRUD API. And these are all the HTTP methods. This is the default endpoint. That is actually this one. If we try this, we are going to receive the hello world, this one. So we are not going to do anything with this. Let's move on to the shops. This is the one that we just modified. For example, we can check the schema. This is the shop DTO that we just changed, adding this to decorators. So this is the title property that is a string, and this is the description that we defined it here. I'm going to fix this. And the same for the salary, the default value, and the expected salary of the shop position. This is the description that we assigned here. Okay. And if you go to the get endpoint, where we get the list of the shops, here are the responses. Here is the OK response. That is actually this one. API OK response. And this is the description. And we can see the same description here. And this is for the 403 code, the forbidden response. And this is the description that is the same that we have here. And it's going to be the same for the rest. Here, here, and the others. Okay, and let's try this one. If we run this, we only have one shop position in the database. That is this JavaScript developer position. And here we have the schema associated to the request. Let's create one. So we're going to create a new shop posting. Let's call it C++ developer. And salary 9,000. And let's run this. And here we have our new shop posting. If we go back and we execute the get operation to get the list of all the positions available, here we get the JavaScript developer and the C++ developer. Okay, and here we can also get a specific shop. For example, if I copy this identifier, and I'm going to click here and try this out, I can enter the identifier here, execute this request, and I get the expected shop posting for that identifier. And I can also modify that same object from here, or I can delete that element. So I'm going to copy this, and let's change the salary. And I need to enter the identifier. And if I run this here, I get a bad request, unexpected token. Yeah, that. Okay. And here I get the updated posting. Okay. And if I go here to the get by ID, if I use that identifier, I should get the updated response. Yes, with the new salary. Okay, and now I'm going to remove this shop posting. I'm going to enter the ID here, and I'm going to execute that request. And I get that 200, so it was successfully removed. if I go back and if I get the list of all the shop postings available, I should get the JavaScript developer. And that's the only element that we have in the database. Okay, this is what I have to show you for the Swagger documentation. Now let's move on to the Compodoc documentation. So Compodoc is a documentation tool for Angular, and it also supports NestJS, and is going to generate static documentation. So basically, it's going to parse the source code of our application, and it's going to generate a bunch of HTML files that we will be able to access from the web browser. We're going to see that in a minute. And some other characteristics are it provides a clean and simple design, and it provides some themes that we can select. It supports 4 languages, and we can also search within this UI that Compodoc creates. It also generates automatically a table of contents for our documentation, and it's a local tool. It's going to run locally, of course, in our development environment, and it's going to start a web server where it's going to serve these HTML files with the documentation. And no TypeScript compilation. Compodoc is only parsing the TypeScript code as it is, so it's not transpiling anything. And it also supports some decorators from the JS doc library: at param, at returns, at link, at ignore, at example. And it also provides a reporting on the documentation coverage. And those are the main features of this tool. So let's go back to Visual Studio Code. Let's close this, and let's install the Compodoc dependency. So let's run npm install -t. This is going to be installed in the development environment at Compodoc/Compodoc. Okay, now that Compodoc is installed, I'm going to add a script here. And this script is going to generate the documentation, and it's going to open the browser on port 8080 because it's going to start an HTTP server on that port, and we are going to be able to access the documentation from localhost port 8080. So I'm going to create a script. I'm going to call it Compodoc, and the command is going to be npx Compodoc -p, and it's going to take the tsconfig file. This is where we configure the transpiling of the TypeScript code, -s. And let's run that script, npm run Compodoc. And this is going to generate a folder that we're going to see here. This documentation folder with a bunch of HTML files and folders, etc. And now we can access the documentation using this thing. Okay, on the left side, we can see this index, let's say, or this table of contents. And here we can see the modules, the classes, the interfaces, some miscellaneous, and the documentation coverage reporting here. So here is the README file. Here we have some graphics of the modules of the application. Here we have the app service and the app module. This is the default module. We can zoom in. These are the default modules that come with the application. And here is the module that we created, the shops module and the shops service. And we can check more details here. We have the app controller, we have the app service. This is the default module. And here we can go to the shops module where we can see the shops controller. Here we have all the methods, the source file. Here we have all the decorators that we created for Swagger. And here we can access the DTO definition with all the properties. And let's go back. We can see all the methods of the controller. We can also access the shop service documentation, the source file, or we can see directly the source file here. And we have access to the documentation of the different methods of the service. And here we have access to the DTO, interfaces that we are using. And here we can search, for example, if we want to search for the shops controller. Here we can see that we get the results. And that's pretty much it. So this is a really good way to document our application. And it's really, really easy. You just run that command, and it generates all this HTML content for you.